Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you are about to witness the very last 24 hours of one of history's most feared and controversial figures. A man whose decisions shook the entire world, whose actions led to destruction and suffering on an unimaginable scale, and whose final day was spent not on a battlefield, but deep underground in silence, fear, and despair. Today, you and I are going to walk together through the chilling story of Adolf Hitler's final moments on Earth. But before we begin, let me make one thing clear. This video is not political, nor is it about glorifying or vilifying. It is about learning. We are here to understand history, to absorb it as a lesson and to use it as a tool to grow, both in knowledge of the past and in mastery of the English language. Because the best way to learn a language is through stories that stay in our minds forever. And what story could be more unforgettable than the last chapter of a man who once held the world in his grip? As you listen, don't just hear the facts. Feel the atmosphere, the emotions, the weight of choices, the silence in that underground bunker. Imagine the ticking clock as the world outside burned and collapsed, while inside, one man faced the inevitable. By following this story, you will not only sharpen your understanding of English, but also see history come alive before your eyes. So, stay with me until the very end. This journey will take us through the darkness of the bunker, through the final conversations, through the last decisions, and finally, into the silence that followed. And if you find this way of learning powerful, meaningful, and unforgettable, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history and learning as much as you do. Together we can turn stories into lessons and lessons into strength. April 29, 1945. Berlin is no longer the proud capital of a powerful empire. It is a shattered city, crumbling under the relentless thunder of Soviet artillery. Buildings that once echoed with the voices of families, laughter, and life are now reduced to smoldering ruins. The streets are filled with rubble, smoke, and silence, broken only by the distant cries of civilians and the steady pounding of bombs. The once mighty Reich is breathing its final, painful breaths. Deep beneath this broken city, hidden under layers of concrete and steel, lies a cold and suffocating space. Adolf Hitler's underground bunker. The world above is collapsing, but inside these walls time feels strangely frozen. The air is heavy, damp, and stale, filled with the scent of fear, sweat, and hopelessness. Officers, secretaries, and guards move quietly, their faces pale, their eyes heavy. They know the end is coming. They know there is no escape. And there, in the very heart of this bunker, sits Hitler himself. Once the man who commanded millions, now reduced to a pale, trembling figure, pacing slowly, his health failing, his hands shaking. The weight of his collapsing world presses down on him. Outside, the Red Army is closing in, block by block, street by street. Inside, his power has dwindled to words, desperate orders that no longer matter, commands that vanish into chaos. This is where our story begins. Not in the glory of parades, not in the thunder of speeches, but in the shadows of a dark bunker, where even the most powerful man in the world cannot stop the ticking of time. As the night of April 29th fades into the final day, history itself holds its breath. And as we step into this story together, remember, we are not just recounting the fall of a dictator. We are learning the language of history, the language of truth, the language that allows us to connect with the past and prepare for the future. If this journey already has your attention, don't forget to stay with me until the end, because what happens next is not just a lesson. It is a haunting reminder of how every empire, no matter how strong, eventually faces its final hour. In the early hours of April 29, 1945, as the world above crumbled into fire and ash, something astonishing took place inside the bunker. After 14 years of secrecy, distance, and shadows, Adolf Hitler finally married Eva Braun. It was an act no one expected at such a time, and not in celebration, not in hope, but in resignation. The room where it happened was dimly lit, quiet except for the muffled roar of artillery shaking the ground above. There were no flowers, no music, no laughter. Instead of joy, the air was heavy with the scent of defeat. Those present described the atmosphere as more like a funeral than a wedding. A short civil ceremony was conducted by a local official, with only a handful of witnesses standing nearby. Hitler, pale and weary, signed his name. Eva, the woman who had stood by him in silence for years, finally became his wife, not at the height of power, but at the edge of death. It was not love that history remembers here, but the symbolism of it all. A dictator who once sought to rule the world, now reduced to clinging to the last personal bond he had left. A woman who had spent her youth waiting for recognition, finally receiving it when nothing remained. The marriage lasted only a single day, a grim reminder that power, wealth, and ambition ultimately mean nothing when the clock of history strikes its final hour. Imagine the silence in that room. No cheers, no celebration, just the quiet scratching of pens, the shuffle of footsteps, and the constant echo of destruction overhead. Even in this supposed moment of intimacy, the shadow of death loomed larger than life itself. This was not a wedding. It was a farewell, a final gesture before both would step willingly into the abyss together. And as we follow their story, we begin to see how even the strongest facades of power eventually collapse into dust and silence. If you find yourself drawn into these moments and into the strange mix of history and humanity, then make sure you keep watching until the end, because the events that follow this marriage will leave you shaken. After the strange, somber wedding, Hitler turned his attention to something he considered even more important: his final words to the world. On April 29th, just hours before his death, he dictated his political testament. Sitting in the bunker, pale and exhausted, he summoned his secretaries and began to speak. His voice, once thunderous and commanding, was now weak, but still carried the bitterness and obsession that had defined his life. In this document, he blamed everyone but himself. He accused the Jewish people of being the root of Germany's downfall, repeating the hatred that had fueled his rise to power. He condemned his own generals, accusing them of cowardice, betrayal, and failure. Even at the edge of defeat, he refused to take responsibility for the destruction he had unleashed on the world and on his own nation. His words were not of regret, but of anger, denial, and bitterness. But one request stood out above all. He demanded that after his death, his body be burned. He knew what had happened to Mussolini, dragged into the streets, mocked, mutilated, and humiliated. He could not bear the thought of such a fate. His pride, his image, his control over how history would see him, mattered more to him than anything else, even in his final hours. He ordered that his body and Eva's must be destroyed in fire, leaving nothing for his enemies to display. The scene was chilling. Picture him in that bunker, a man who once commanded millions, now scribbling his last desperate attempt to control the story of his life and death. There was no humility, no apology, no moment of humanity, only anger, blame, and fear of humiliation. As he signed his name to the testament, he may have believed that history would remember him as a martyr. Instead, history remembers these final words as proof of a man trapped by his own hatred until the very end. And as we move forward, deeper into these last hours, remember this: the words we leave behind, the choices we make when everything is stripped away, reveal who we truly are. If this journey into the final hours of history is giving you both lessons in language and lessons in life, make sure to stay until the very end, because the darkest moments are yet to come. The bunker was no palace. It was a tomb in waiting. The deeper one went underground, the heavier the air became, thick, damp, filled with the stale smell of sweat, smoke, and fear. Every corridor echoed with silence, interrupted only by the muffled thunder of Soviet artillery striking above. For those inside, each explosion was a reminder that the world outside was crumbling inch by inch, and the walls that protected them today might bury them tomorrow. The people trapped there with Hitler felt it in their bones. Officers whispered in corners, their faces pale and hollow. Secretaries worked mechanically, typing words they knew would soon be meaningless. Even the guards, once proud symbols of loyalty, now moved like shadows, unsure if they were guarding a leader or waiting for death. Fear seeped into every breath, pressing on everyone like an invisible weight. And yet, in the middle of this suffocating silence, Hitler and Eva sat together in a strangely ordinary way. They shared cups of tea as if it were just another evening, though outside the city screamed in fire. There was no laughter, no conversation about the future. Only short exchanges, long silences, and the clinking of porcelain cups against saucers. Eva, calm and devoted, stayed by his side, even though she knew exactly what awaited them both. It is haunting to imagine. The man who once stood before roaring crowds of millions, now reduced to a pale figure, hunched in a chair, sipping tea while his empire collapsed overhead. The woman who had waited years for recognition, now holding on to her final day as a wife, not in joy but in the quiet company of despair. The atmosphere in that bunker was more than fear. It was resignation. Everyone there knew the end was coming. They just didn't know the exact hour. Each tick of the clock, each tremor of the ground carried the weight of finality. This is what makes the story of Hitler's last 24 hours so chilling. It wasn't just the sound of bombs or the chaos outside, it was the silence inside. A silence so heavy it felt like death itself was already in the room waiting. If this atmosphere grips you as much as it does me, stay with this story until the end. Because what began with silence will soon erupt into the final, irreversible act that sealed history forever. It was in these final, suffocating hours that Hitler received a piece of news that struck him harder than the bombs pounding Berlin. Heinrich Himmler, the man he once called his most loyal follower, the architect of the SS, the very embodiment of obedience to his will, had secretly opened peace negotiations with the Allies. The message fell like a knife into the bunker. For years, Hitler had trusted Himmler as his iron shield, the man who would carry out his orders without question. And now, in the very last days of the Reich, that trust shattered. To Hitler, this was not just betrayal. It was the final confirmation that the system he had built with fire and blood was collapsing around him. Witnesses described him as shaking with rage, his pale face twisted with fury. He shouted, cursed, and denounced Himmler as a traitor deserving of the harshest punishment. But deep down, he knew what this meant. If even Himmler had abandoned him, there was no loyalty left, no salvation, no hope of turning the tide. The empire he had commanded with absolute authority was gone, eaten away by fear, desperation, and betrayal. Imagine that moment. A man who once demanded total obedience from millions now sat in a bunker, betrayed by one of his closest lieutenants. The very machine of power he had built was crumbling piece by piece, leaving him isolated, powerless, and surrounded by people who were only waiting for the end. This was the true death of the Reich, not on the battlefield, but in the breaking of loyalty and the collapse of trust. In the moment when betrayal exposed the weakness at its very core, Hitler's world was shrinking rapidly, and even those he believed unshakable were slipping away from him. The rage he felt that night was not just about Himmler. It was about himself, about the realization that everything he had believed indestructible was falling apart, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it. And as the night dragged on in that bunker, one thing became clearer than ever. Death was not approaching. It was already in the room, drawing closer with every act of betrayal, every crumbling wall, every shattered illusion of power. If you are following this journey step by step, don't stop now, because the closer we move to the final hour, the heavier and more haunting this story becomes. In the bunker's dim corridors, a new and unsettling scene unfolded. One that revealed just how close the end had come. Hitler, now fully convinced that death was his only escape, wanted certainty. He needed to know that the method he had chosen, cyanide, would work swiftly without failure. But instead of testing it on himself, he turned to the one creature that had been his most loyal companion, his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. Blondie had been at his side for years, a symbol of loyalty and devotion. Soldiers and staff often saw the dog as the only being that softened Hitler's cold exterior. And yet in this final hour, even Blondie was not spared. The capsule was forced into her mouth, and within moments she collapsed lifeless on the cold concrete floor. Those who witnessed it were shaken. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of bombs above. But it did not end there. Eva Braun's two small dogs were also poisoned. There was no reason beyond paranoia, beyond a desire to erase every living trace of their existence before the Soviets arrived. These deaths were not just the killing of animals. They were a chilling rehearsal, a symbolic preparation for what was about to happen to their owners. It is haunting to imagine. A bunker filled with the smell of cyanide, the loyal companions lying lifeless, and their masters watching quietly, as if looking into their own future. Hitler's decision to kill Blondie revealed the depth of his fear, his obsession with control, and his determination to face death on his own terms, not risk humiliation at the hands of his enemies. This was not merely an experiment, it was a statement. Everything he had built was gone. Every bond was breaking, and even the creatures who trusted him most were sacrificed in the name of certainty. The act stripped away the last traces of humanity in that bunker. From this point on, there was no turning back. Death was not just near. It had already entered, silently waiting for the final step. And as we move closer to that moment, remember, history is not only about battles and victories. Sometimes it is about these quiet, horrifying choices that reveal the true face of fear and desperation. The bunker doors creaked open and closed like a heartbeat, slow, final, and impossible to stop. Outside, Berlin was a ruined maze of smoke and fire. Inside, the few remaining officers pleaded with the man who had once commanded millions. "Führer, we can get you out," they whispered urgently. "There is a plane, a disguise, a route to the south. Please, this can still be done." But Hitler's answer was not a frantic plan or a promise. It was a quiet, iron refusal. He looked at them with eyes that had lost their old thunder. His voice was low, almost hollow. "No," he said. "I will not run. I will remain in Berlin. I will die here." The words dropped like stones in the tiny room. For a man whose identity had been built on conquest and control, this choice was both shocking and absolute. He was no longer interested in escape, in bargaining, or in legacy through survival. He wanted his end to be in the place where his dream had been born, and where it now shattered. Some officers begged harder, pleading for disguises and secret tunnels. Others simply stood in stunned silence, their hands trembling. A few were relieved. The moral burden of remaining with a collapsing regime had become unbearable. Hitler, calm but resolute, granted permission for those who wished to flee. He told them to go through the sewers, to take whatever chance they could. "Leave," he said, "and try to live." Watching them prepare to leave, he showed no desperation to stop them. His world had narrowed to the room around him and the decision he had made. This refusal was not bravado. It carried the weight of a man who had seen his empire crumble and chose not to witness its desecration by foreign boots. It was also an acceptance, a final devastating admission that everything he had built had ended. In that acceptance, there was neither heroism nor humility. There was a stubborn desire to control the last image of himself. Not captured, not paraded, but gone by his own hand. For the men who left that night, the streets above would be a battlefield that either swallowed them or spat them out. Many would not survive. For those who stayed, secretaries, aides, a handful of loyal soldiers, the bunker became a shrinking island of inevitability. The choice to leave or remain became a moral and physical crossroads, and each person had to make it alone. When history looks back at that moment, it sees more than a strategic decision. It sees a profound human truth. When power collapses, the choices people make reveal their deepest values: courage, cowardice, loyalty, or selfishness. Hitler chose to stay, to accept the end on his terms. Others chose to flee, to gamble on life beyond the ruins. Stay with me, because in the next moments we will watch how that acceptance turned into action, how preparations for death unfolded, and how the last quiet gestures in that bunker sealed the fate of a regime. If this story helps you understand history and sharpen your English, please like this video, subscribe for more narrated lessons, and share it so others can learn from the past. The corridors of the bunker were filled with silence, an unnatural quiet, broken only by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery above. Then a sound no one expected. The door to Hitler's private room creaked open. He stepped out slowly, his figure shrunken, his face pale and drawn. Gone was the fiery dictator who once roared before crowds of thousands. What remained was a ghost-like man, walking toward his final goodbyes. One by one, his secretaries, aides, and guards stood in line. Their eyes brimmed with tears, their hands shaking, for they knew exactly what this moment meant. Hitler extended his hand to each of them, his grip weak but steady. He looked into their faces, not with the fury or command they had always known, but with a strange, almost hollow calm. To some, he offered a few words. To others, only a nod. For the secretaries who had stayed faithfully by his side, his thanks were brief, almost whispered. They wept openly, unable to hide the grief of watching the man who had defined their lives walk into history's abyss. Witnesses later said the atmosphere felt like a funeral before the death. The bunker seemed to shrink, the air heavier with every handshake, every farewell. These were not the words of a leader rallying his people, but of a man cutting the final threads that tied him to life. And yet strangely, he showed no fear. His calmness unsettled those around him, making the finality of the moment even more unbearable. When the last handshake was given, he dismissed them. Some staggered away in tears, others stood frozen in disbelief. It was the last time they would see him alive. This scene reminds us that history is not only written in battles and speeches, but also in these intimate, heartbreaking moments of farewell, moments when human fragility overshadows power. And as the bunker doors closed again, everyone inside knew the end was only minutes away. Stay with me, because next we'll step into the most defining moment of all, the final act inside that bunker, when Hitler and Eva Braun sealed their fate. If you find this storytelling valuable, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share so more people can learn history in this powerful way. The bunker was no longer a command center. It had become a waiting room for death. Night fell like a heavy curtain, and inside those concrete walls time slowed until every second felt endless. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun sat together in a small dim room, not speaking much, not because they had nothing to say, but because words had already been used up by mistakes and shouted orders long ago. There were small rituals that evening, ordinary things that suddenly felt like acts of finality. A servant brought them a plain meal, dry bread, a smear of honey, a weak cup of tea. They ate slowly, mechanically, as if tasting could somehow anchor them to the world above that was burning. The clink of a spoon, the rustle of a paper napkin. The room was full of sounds that meant nothing and everything at once. Each bite, each sip was an agreement with the ending they had chosen to face. Hitler moved with a quiet, surprised slowness. The thrumming energy that had once carried him onto podiums and into history was gone. He sat and wrote, pages filled with the last of his thoughts, rigid lines of blame and justification, words carefully chosen to form a testament for a world he would no longer look upon. His handwriting trembled. His sentences did not bend toward remorse. They bent toward legacy, the last attempt to control the story of a life that had spun out of control. Eva sat beside him, calm and strangely blank, as if the long wait had numbed every feeling except a steady private loyalty. She adjusted a bit of fabric at her sleeve, looked up once, and their eyes met for a moment. No declarations of love, no promises, just a shared stillness, as if two people on opposite sides of a falling bridge had found a way to hold hands for a single breath. Around them, the bunker breathed with its own low life. Secretaries typed pages that would never be read. Officers moved like ghosts along the corridors, checking radios and maps that meant nothing now. Conversations were whispers. Laughter had vanished months earlier. Even anger had burned out, leaving only a gray acceptance. The staff who remained exchanged looks instead of arguments, and every face carried the same thin, pale resignation. Outside, the city convulsed under artillery fire. Inside, the walls shook with each distant explosion, but the noise only made the silence in the room deeper. It was as if the earth itself wanted to drown out what was happening below. The bunker's air was stale and heavy, making breathing a small, deliberate act. Each inhale was a countdown, each exhale a long goodbye. When the clocks in that underground world marked midnight and then morning, nothing spectacular happened. No dramatic last speech, no final command, just small human preparations, carefully folded clothes, a few whispered instructions to trusted aides, the quiet placing of objects into drawers as if to tidy up a life for those who would come after. The ordinary tasks felt like prayers, they felt like goodbyes. In that room, time had become a single narrow tunnel, and both of them sat at the mouth of it, looking out at the last light they would ever see. It is a strange thing to watch the end of a life stripped of spectacle, to see how power, which once demanded the attention of nations, can reduce a man to handwriting and a bowl of bread. If this moment touches you, if the quiet horror and strange humanity of it stays with you, then keep watching. There is more to come, and together we will continue to learn from history while sharpening your English. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe for more deep narrated stories, and share this with someone who values truth and learning. Your support helps keep these important lessons alive. Morning came slowly to the underground bunker, though no sunlight pierced its walls. It was April 30th, 1945, a date that would etch itself into the memory of history. The air was thick, heavy, and strangely ceremonial, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Adolf Hitler rose early. Despite the chaos outside, despite the certainty of defeat, he clung to routine with a rigid, almost desperate precision. His uniform was laid out carefully, pressed and neat, the symbols of power still stitched across the fabric. He dressed slowly, button by button, every movement deliberate, every gesture an attempt to control what little remained of a collapsing world. Eva Braun, too, prepared herself. She chose a black dress, elegant yet simple, as if preparing for both a farewell and a stage she would never leave. Her hair was neatly arranged, her face calm, almost serene. Together they looked less like a couple beginning a new day, and more like actors dressing for the final scene of a play they both knew by heart. Afterwards, Hitler summoned his closest aides. His voice was firm, stripped of the fiery passion it once carried, but still absolute in tone. He issued his final, most personal command. After his death, his body and Eva's must be burned, reduced to ashes. He would not allow his corpse to become a spectacle, desecrated and displayed like Mussolini's had been. The order was not just about fear of humiliation. It was about control, even in death. His image, his legacy, his very remains had to be managed according to his will. The staff listened in silence, some nodding, others staring at the floor. They knew the order was cruelly practical. Gasoline was already stored for the task. They also knew it was inevitable. Every word spoken in that bunker carried the weight of finality, and this command was the clearest proof yet that the end was no longer distant. It was hours away. Around them, the walls trembled with artillery. The city above was collapsing into fire and rubble, but inside everything was strangely still. The bunker had become a theater of ritual, dressing, preparing, commanding, all steps in a carefully staged goodbye. This was no ordinary morning. It was the last morning, the final hours of two lives that would vanish before the sunset. And as the orders were given, as the uniforms were buttoned and the dress adjusted, one truth became impossible to ignore. Even the most powerful man in the world could not escape the inevitability of death. If this glimpse into the final morning of history's darkest figure grips you,
stay with us.
The most haunting moments are yet to unfold. Make sure to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with others who want to learn through history's most unforgettable stories. Your support keeps this channel alive, and together we'll continue to uncover lessons the world must never forget. The afternoon of April 30th moved with a terrible calm, as if the world had paused and waited for the last page to be turned. In the bunker, the air felt electric and unbearably small. Clocks ticked. Footsteps echoed. Outside, Berlin convulsed under bombardment. Inside, everything had shrunk to a single inevitable decision. Around 3:30 p.m., the final act began. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic music, only the hush of people holding their breath. Eva sat beside Hitler on the small sofa in their private room. Witnesses later described how the pair looked oddly ordinary in that moment. Two figures facing the same end, both calm, both resigned. Then a faint, almost invisible gesture, Eva lifting a small brass capsule to her lips. She swallowed it. The smell that followed, faint but unmistakable to those who knew it, was the bitter almond trace of cyanide. Her body slumped silently. No scream, no struggle, just the quiet fall of a life ending in a room that had for so long sheltered plans of horror. Seconds later, a single gunshot shattered the silence. It was simple, brutal, and final. The sound came from inside the private chamber. Hitler had used his Walther pistol. When the aides forced the door open, what they found was a scene that would haunt history. A man slumped on the sofa, a dark wound at his temple, and Eva motionless beside him. No visible wound, but the bitter evidence of poison in the air. The room smelled of powder and something metallic. Blood had spattered across the upholstery and the carpet. Around them lay the neat traces of routine. A half-empty cup of tea, a folded jacket, an evening that had ended in an instant. The men who entered the room, Otto and Heinz among them, did not rush. They moved with the mechanical motions of those who have seen too much and yet must do what must be done. They wrapped the bodies in blankets, their hands trembling. They checked for any sign of life and found none. There was no dramatic last confession, no final plea. Only an awful, indifferent stillness that spoke louder than any words could. What happened in those minutes revealed more than the physical method of death. It revealed the mind of a man who could not bear the thought of capture or humiliation. who chose to vanish on his own terms. It revealed a matching loyalty in a companion who had spent years in the shadows, finally stepping into the same darkness by his side. For those left alive in that bunker, the sight was shattering. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unable to carry the image into the world above. Orders given earlier that morning now became grim instructions to be executed without delay. The aides carried the wrapped bodies through the narrow stairwell into the garden above, a place still choking with smoke and the residue of war. There, under a sky torn by artillery, they poured petrol over the blankets and set them alight. Flames licked hungrily at the cloth, at the faces beneath, as if trying to erase even the last physical trace. But the fire could not fully consume them. Rain, limited fuel, and the chaos of the moment prevented a complete incineration. The remains were hastily buried in a shallow pit. Whatever dignity the act might have appeared to afford, swallowed up by the urgency and terror of the surrounding battle. The double suicide, part poison, part bullet, left an eerie silence in its wake. Outside, the Reich, still defeated, fought on. Inside, the apparatus that had produced so much pain and destruction had ended in the quiet of a room meant for private life. The world would react with shock, relief, confusion, and a flurry of rumor. For many, it felt almost unbelievable that a man who had loomed so large over history could disappear in such a small, private way. History gives us details to learn from, not to glorify. The method they chose, the cyanide capsule that Eva swallowed, the pistol Hitler used, speaks to the desperation of total defeat and the determination of two people to control their ending. But the image we must carry forward is not the morbid curiosity of their death. It is the lesson in consequence. Decisions made by leaders can ripple outward into unimaginable suffering. And when those decisions lead to ruin, the end often arrives with a quiet cruelty that a battlefield never promises. The end of choices, the end of voices, the end of denial. If this account helped you understand the gravity of those last minutes and sharpened your historical English, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who studies history or is learning English. These are the moments that teach us why remembering matters. Thank you for watching, and stay with us for the next episode where we trace the immediate aftermath, the fate of the bunker's survivors, and how the world tried to make sense of the silence that followed. They moved with the deliberate, mechanical calm of people who had been ordered to finish a task they never wanted to do. The blankets were heavy in their arms, the shapes inside defined and final. Otto and Heinz, two men who had watched history unfold and now had to close its last ugly scene, wrapped the bodies carefully, folding cloth over shoulders and faces as if they could preserve some dignity against the ruin around them. There was no fanfare, no prayer, only the quiet rustle of fabric and the distant thunder of guns above. Carrying the bundles up the narrow staircase, each step felt like climbing out of a world that had already died. The stairwell was tight, the smell of smoke and wet earth growing stronger as they pushed through the bunker exit into the shattered garden. Daylight struck like an accusation, the sky a dirty, smoke-laced gray. Around them, Berlin was a city in pieces, walls gouged by shells, windows gone, streets that once carried life now full of rubble and silence. Yet in the middle of this ruined landscape they had one impossible task: to erase two lives so utterly that no one could turn them into trophies of hatred or grief. They placed the wrapped forms in a shallow crater, a small bowl in the scorched ground made by some earlier blast. Hands that had saluted the man who once ruled Europe now shook as they tipped can after can of petrol. The first pour hissed on the fabric. The scent of fuel mixed with the bitter tang of blood and the metallic reek of spent powder. A match struck, a small flame arced, and suddenly the air filled with orange and black smoke. The blankets and the clothing caught fire quickly, flames licking upward as if trying to devour not only flesh but memory. For a few terrifying minutes the fire did its work, turning cloth and hair into ash. But the attempt to erase was imperfect. Rain-slick mud and the limited supply of gasoline meant the blaze could not consume everything. Shapes remained, charred, unclean, still unlike the complete annihilation Hitler had ordered. Under the roar of distant artillery, Otto and Heinz worked fast. They recovered the partially burned remains with soil, wooden scraps, anything that would hide what had been. They dug a shallow grave, shoving earth back over the blackened remnants, tamping it down with boots that had once walked parade grounds. The burying itself had the feel of a hurried ritual, An attempt at closure performed without ceremony or grief, only the urgency of war and the terror of being discovered. Then, trembling, they stepped back into the bunker to report, it was done. The Führer was dead. His body had been burned and hidden, but the story did not end cleanly. Later attempts were made to ensure the remains could never be found. Additional burns, more digging even, according to some reports, the use of heavier tools to crush what was left. Despite these measures, the chaotic theater of collapse left traces. Partial remains were discovered by Soviet forces who searched the grounds. The scene became a messy proof against the myth of escape that would later swirl through rumor and conspiracy. In those first frantic hours, though, those who carried out the final orders believed they had fulfilled the last wish. No public spectacle, no desecration, no triumphal display of a corpse. The image of that burning in the garden is a powerful and terrible symbol. Everything Hitler tried to command in life, control, image, narrative, was here, in these last acts reduced to ash and hurried soil. For those who had followed him blindly, the sight must have been unbearable. For those who had suffered because of his choices, it may have been some small bitter relief. For history, it became a final human detail, a private eraser attempting to wipe out one of the century's worst crimes. As the smoke drifted into the gray sky and the bunker doors closed once more, a quieter question remained. What do we do with the remains of evil? Do we hide them, burn them, study them, or use them to teach? The answer, we learned from what followed, was to preserve truth. Despite attempts to destroy the physical evidence, the facts survived: documents, testimony, dental records, and with time the full truth of those last hours emerged. If this account moved you, and you want more deep narrated history presented with clarity for learners of English and lovers of truth, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to see how history closes its darkest chapters, so we remember, learn, and never repeat. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for the next episode, where we trace the immediate aftermath and how the world uncovered the truth beneath the ash. The garden above still carried the acrid stench of gasoline and smoke, but inside the bunker the air was heavier with something else: despair. Hitler was gone, his body burned, his presence erased, and yet the machinery of his collapsing empire still ticked for a few hollow hours. The men and women who had followed him underground now faced the same question: live to see defeat, or choose to die with the Reich. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda who had once painted visions of eternal victory, was left as the highest-ranking official in the bunker. To him, survival meant betrayal. To live in a world without Hitler, he declared, was unthinkable. But his conviction carried a horror beyond himself. It included his family. In one of the most chilling acts of the war's end, Goebbels and his wife Magda led their 6 children into what they called a peaceful sleep. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, were dressed in their nightclothes and given sedatives. Magda kissed each one, tucking them in as if preparing them for bed. Then, under the quiet hum of the bunker, cyanide capsules were pressed between their small teeth. One by one, the children's breathing slowed, their bodies went still. In that moment, the promise of a future was extinguished, not by war's fire, but by their own parents' fanatic devotion to a dying cause. Hours later, Joseph and Magda walked calmly into the garden above. With a final act of loyalty twisted into despair, they took poison themselves. Some accounts suggest Joseph also fired a pistol. Their bodies, like Hitler's, were quickly burned, though not as completely. Flames consumed part of what remained, leaving blackened figures sprawled in the ruined garden. The man who had filled the world with lies ended not with a speech but in silence beside his wife's corpse. Meanwhile, others in the bunker made different choices. Secretaries, guards, aides, all faced the encroaching thunder of Soviet troops drawing closer with every hour. Some packed small bags, disguising themselves in plain uniforms, hoping to slip out into the chaos of Berlin. In groups or alone, they crept through the shattered city, darting past rubble and flame, running from the underground tomb that had been their prison. Yet escape was nearly impossible. Most were captured within days by Soviet soldiers, their brief attempts at freedom ending in interrogation or prison. A handful vanished into the smoke and rubble, their fates uncertain. The bunker itself became less a command post and more a graveyard of choices: poison, pistol, or the desperate gamble of escape. Every corridor echoed with finality. What had once been the nerve center of a vast empire had devolved into a chamber of death, where even children were not spared the price of loyalty. This was the collapse of the bunker, not just the physical end of Hitler's underground fortress, but the collapse of the illusion it had sheltered. Inside those concrete walls, the last loyalists of the Reich faced the truth. Their leader was gone, their cause was lost, and their fates, one way or another, were sealed. History demands we linger here not to sensationalize but to understand. The choices made in those final days remind us of the dangers of blind devotion, of surrendering reason and humanity to ideology. The bunker's collapse was not only military, it was moral, personal, and absolute. If this story gripped you, and if you believe history's darkest chapters must be told to prevent their return, support this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Together, we'll keep learning through stories that show how even the mightiest empires can end in silence, smoke, and tragedy. The guns finally fell silent above Berlin, but the world was left with a haunting question. What exactly had happened inside Hitler's bunker? For the Soviets, who were the first to storm the ruins, the discovery was grim but critical. Among the rubble and shallow graves in the garden, they recovered the charred remains of Hitler, Eva Braun, and the Goebbels family. The evidence was there, burned, fractured, incomplete, but enough to prove that the architect of war had not escaped. And yet, Stalin chose secrecy. He concealed the findings even from his allies. To the Soviet people, and to much of the world, the details of Hitler's death were withheld, twisted, or left deliberately vague. Was he really dead? Had he fled to Argentina, Spain, or even Antarctica, as wild rumors later claimed? This silence gave birth to myths, stories of a dictator who had slipped through the cracks of history, still alive somewhere, waiting. For years, these escape theories spread like wildfire, fueled by Stalin's refusal to confirm the truth. It wasn't until decades later that the evidence resurfaced. Carefully guarded in Soviet archives were fragments of skull and jawbone, along with dental remains taken from the bunker site. In the 1970s, Hitler's dental staff was questioned, and their testimonies matched the recovered records precisely. Finally, science gave its verdict. The man who had unleashed destruction across continents had indeed perished on April 30th, 1945, in that underground bunker. The myths, though persistent, were stripped of their foundation. Meanwhile, Germany itself lay shattered. Within a week of Hitler's death, the nation formally surrendered. The war in Europe ended, bringing relief but also a reckoning with the devastation left behind. Cities in ruins, millions dead, and survivors scarred in body and soul. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years had collapsed in just 12. The site of the bunker, once a place of command and terror, was eventually destroyed and erased. The Soviets filled it with concrete, built apartments and parking lots over its location, determined that no monument or shrine to tyranny would remain. Today, only a modest plaque marks the ground where one of history's darkest chapters ended. No fanfare, no glorification, just a quiet reminder. And what then is the legacy of those final 24 hours? It is not simply the death of a dictator. It is the proof that hate, no matter how powerful it seems, carries within it the seed of collapse. It is a warning about unchecked power, blind obedience, and the cost of building nations on fear and division. It is also a lesson in truth, that even when leaders try to control the narrative, history finds a way to reveal what really happened. The bunker has long since vanished, but the story endures not as a relic of evil, but as a cautionary tale for generations. The ruins of Berlin remind us what happens when ambition turns to tyranny, and when humanity forgets its responsibility to question, to resist, and to remember. If this story left you thinking, share it. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and pass it on, because history, when told truthfully, is not just about the past. It's a mirror for the present and a guide for the future. And the lessons of those final 24 hours are ones the world must never forget.